The jump to the next generation of gaming consoles is being accompanied by a significant jump in the graphical power of the consoles. GPUs are more than twice as powerful. The Xbox One X, the most powerful console of the last generation, sits at around 6 teraflops of computing power. The Xbox Series X, which seems like it's going to be the most powerful next-gen console, is said to possess around 12 teraflops of computing power. The PS5 graphics card runs at about 10.3 teraflops, while the PS4 Pro ran at 4.2 teraflops. If you don't know, teraflops is essentially the amount of floating point operations a piece of computing equipment can achieve within a given time. CPUs are more powerful. The Xbox One X has an 8-core CPU running at 2.3 GHz, while the Series X runs at 3.8 GHz. The consoles have better RAM and performance across the board. The Xbox Series X and PS5 both have 16 GB of RAM. The Xbox One X had 12 GB of RAM. However, one thing that hasn't gotten better in this time is storage size. The PS4 Pro had a default storage size of 1 TB. The PS5 has a storage size of around 825 GB. Although both of the next-gen consoles will be using solid-state drives, which is significantly quicker in loading times than regular hard drives. So we have virtually the same quantity of storage, but it's not like the games haven't gotten bigger in that time. No, in fact, the size of games has increased exponentially. Destiny 2 on Steam says it requires 105 GB of space. It's a similar size on consoles. Call of Duty Modern Warfare requires a ludicrous 219 GB of disk space. In actuality, it eats up a little over 180 GB. Either way, games now are ridiculously huge. How have games improved in this time to warrant this massive increase in size that they've seen in recent years anyway? I would argue that we haven't seen a significant increase in depth in this time. Most of this new space isn't being used to create new gameplay opportunities or complex mechanics. There hasn't been a massive surge in the level of content either. Skyrim was under 15 GB. Morrowind was under 1. Recent RPGs like Divinity Original Sin 2, while undoubtedly good games, haven't introduced a massive new wealth of content and gameplay features to justify the increase in size. But obviously that's my opinion. Honestly, all of that's besides the point. Divinity Original Sin 2 isn't even that large as far as modern games go, because game size is increasingly becoming divorced from the quantity of content and gameplay systems. Most of the largest games nowadays, such as the aforementioned Call of Duty Modern Warfare, are not even that much of a departure in terms of content from games from 10 years ago, which were much smaller. Modern Warfare from 2019 has a similar amount of content to Modern Warfare 2 from 2009. Campaign, multiplayer including private matches and loadouts. So what, a few more game modes, character customization? It isn't that significant a leap in content to justify that several times increase in size. So what is happening here? Why are modern games so ridiculously huge nowadays? One obvious reason is the increase in fidelity. The graphics in modern games are far more detailed. There are more polygons on every model, higher resolution textures, more effects and far more sophisticated lighting. The industry is moving towards adapting new features like ray tracing for lighting. With Nvidia's DLSS and its open source counterparts, games are looking to improve frame rates with the aid of neural networks. In the previous generation, games used textures at around 1K resolution, which is just HD. In the current generation, that is Xbox One and PS4, textures on average are around 2K resolution. Next-gen consoles seem to be aiming for mostly 4K textures. This basically means textures will be 4,000 pixels horizontally, on average. The thing is though, 2K textures are 4 times the size of 1K textures. Many textures on the last gen weren't even 1K. Not everything ran in HD on the PS3 and Xbox 360. Textures are typically what takes up a majority of the space on a game's disc. Now, the advantage of better textures is obvious. It makes surfaces and materials look more detailed. In the 90s and in early gaming in general, surfaces tended to need only one texture. Nowadays it's far more standard, almost ubiquitous in fact, to use multiple textures, such as bump maps and normal maps, to calculate things such as how light reacts to surfaces from different angles. A single item in the game world has several textures associated with it. That being said, these things have all existed for a long time, they're not new developments. Models themselves have more polygons than in the past. That is, more individual surfaces on every character, weapon, item, and piece of geometry in the game world. Developers tend to compress fewer things now than in the past. They're no longer limited by having to fit their entire game into a game disc. Modern consoles don't really have plug and play anymore, where you would put in a game disc and it would just start up instantaneously. Every new game you purchase must be installed on the system before it can even be played. Oftentimes, there will be very little actual game data on the disc, and most of it has to be downloaded. It's because game devs no longer have this restriction that they do not compress textures in cinematics as much as they needed to in the last generation. If you don't know, file compression is a process which results in the reduction of space that a file takes up on a storage medium. It does this by searching for redundant information in a file and replacing it with a reference to an entry in a sort of dictionary that contains all of the commonly used terms. For example, if used on a programming language, that would probably be all of the commands that appear regularly. We'd take those out and replace them with a reference to the same thing in the kind of dictionary. For a texture, which are basically image files, the image is broken up into smaller form using the compression algorithm. It uses effectively the same algorithm in reverse to rebuild the image whenever it's loaded. While compression of game files leads to games taking up less space, it does also have the downside of leading to an increase in loading times. Apparently, Killzone Shadowfall for the PS4 was around 290 gigabytes before it was compressed down to 40 gigabytes to fit on the game disc for launch. Whenever you enter a new map in a game, it needs to decompress all the files to load them in. You know how sometimes in games you load in and all of the models are low poly, all the textures are low res and the audio isn't playing yet? That's because the game is still decompressing the files. It's still loading them in. Less compression in modern games have improved load times, but at the cost of taking up more hard drive space. On the same topic of compression, it's common for video files to be compressed. Many games now have pre-rendered cinematics. Because of the same reason as stated before, it's becoming more common for these cinematics to exist uncompressed in the game files. The cinematics are also higher resolution in modern games. Occasionally there will be modern games with 4K in-game cutscenes. The exact same thing applies to audio in games. Uncompressed sound files such as dialogue, music, and sound effects take up a lot of space. In old Grand Theft Auto games, the radio station music made up the majority of the game files. Some people assume that games often have every voice line for every language installed by default, and that's part of why the games are so massive. For example, with Modern Warfare being a massive 219 gigabytes, people believe that devs just lazily left the uncompressed sound files for every language in the game. And that's not true. If you try to install the sound for every language, the install size is, wait for it, 344 gigabytes. It's not just uncompressed languages and audio that have led to this absurd game size. I believe that devs are just less concerned about the size of their games in the current year. They're not limited by physical disc media. It seems that AAA developers are increasingly sacrificing more for diminishing graphical improvements. As poly count on models increases, the benefit to visuals with every subsequent increase diminishes. Some say that this is simply how AAA studios are justifying their budgets nowadays. It's also noteworthy that there has been a kind of counter to this movement in the indie scene with a surge of throwback shooters and low poly style in games. Low poly isn't just an aesthetic either. It has the very practical use of using far fewer resources and being much easier for smaller teams to develop. I think it's quite interesting that indie devs are going back and seeing what we can do with low poly counts and how far you can push them with things like modern lighting engines. Speaking of low poly, I was originally prompted to start thinking about this issue in this way after I loaded Halo Combat Evolved in the Master Chief Collection. Now of course, Halo CE looks about as old as you'd expect a game from 2001 to look. But in the menus, 343 added a new customization screen with skins for the game. This loads the original Halo Combat Evolved weapons in Unreal Engine 4, including the modern lighting engine. It also has slightly cleaned up textures, but for the most part, the models are identical. I just wanted to point out how modern these weapons look with an up-to-date lighting engine. There are some edges, but they're few and far between in my opinion. The weapon models are very solid and hold up extraordinarily well. I guess the moral of the story is that developers need to work smarter with resources and not harder. I know it's easier said than done, but just look at how much something like modern lighting does to improve the visuals on these 20-year-old models. I think the crux of the issue is that developers are no longer bound by the restrictions of having to fit an entire game onto a disc and instead require downloads and installations onto the game system. This is especially the case on PC, where online downloads have almost completely replaced disc media. Disc media is really only a legacy thing for the most hardcore players. Discs are all but dead. I think the problem arises from the fact that this gives some developers license to disregard concerns over space. Many modern games do not respect hard drive space and seem to have no problem taking up as much as they wish. Now, one could simply chalk this up to incompetence, but that's clearly not true. These are AAA studios with millions going through them, and it's not just one studio producing giant game install. It's all across the board. It's every major developer. Now, I think you need to analyze the economic factors. There isn't enough demand from game consumers to reduce the size of games, hence developers have no pressure to do so. Casual gamers tend not to have large game libraries, so it's less of a problem, while hardcore gamers tend to be more willing to spend on things such as external storage. But storage is expensive. It's not a solve-all issue. I think there perhaps may exist a darker, more anti-consumer rationale behind these giant games. It may well be advantageous for these companies to not respect space. Not to say they're doing it intentionally, but rather they have economic justification to not care. I think it would be remiss to ignore the massive surge in free-to-play games in recent years. Look at some of the biggest games out now. Fortnite, Call of Duty Warzone, Apex Legends. It seems that all of the big earners with massive player bases are free-to-play. The free-to-play business model is completely different from regular games. As we know, free-to-play games do not make money from initial purchase, but from microtransactions. If you don't know, the majority of microtransaction purchases come from a small minority of the player base, known colloquially as whales, who spend exorbitant amounts purchasing basically every item in the store. They need to keep this minority of the player base invested for as long as possible, for as many hours of the day. Devs often include things like XP systems that are deliberately designed to avoid player burnout by slowing down player rewards after a certain amount of time played in a day, because they want to keep them playing for a long time. It's more important for a free-to-play game that survives on player investment and smaller amounts of cash paid over time rather than as a lump sum at purchase to keep its player base continually invested in the product. In effect, they need to maximize time spent in the game over a long period of time. They want to monopolize the allocated playtime of every person who downloads the game. Time that a player of theirs spends in another game is effectively money lost for the company, because it's time that could have been spent engaged with their own game. You see games like Destiny and many MMOs have mastered this thing by effectively handing out a laundry list of chores to be completed within a limited time. Now, would it not be in the interests of a game whose business model is predicated on dominating their users' playtime and minimizing time spent in other games to try to take up as much hard drive space as possible? Time is money to these companies, and more space taken up by free-to-play games like Call of Duty Warzone means less space for other games, for other potential distractions from their own game. Another consequence of this is that it creates barriers for entry for smaller developers. If the average gamer can only have a few games installed at a time, it renders it more difficult for indies to break into the zeitgeist by having the average player install their game. In some ways, filling up their players' hard disk space is an advantageous strategy because it helps monopolize their user base's playtime and helps lock out competition. It's much harder to shake up a market which has bigger barriers to entry, which may be part of why so many games are getting remade and remastered rather than having experimental new games break the orthodoxy of AAA multiplayer games. Now, the gaming market of today is by no means completely stagnant. There's plenty of interesting games still coming out, but the negative effect of greater barriers to entry on console marketplaces is, in my opinion, unquestionable. Another possibility we should address is why console disk space hasn't gone up all that much to account for the massive increase in size. Bear with me now, as I'm going to get very speculative. It may well be possible that devs are putting pressure of some kind on consoles to not increase the size of the hard disk by much. I explained previously how it's economically advantageous for them to do so. This is of course just a theory. I understand fully well that storage is expensive. It's less of a case of a conspiracy for corporate interests and more of a case of market pressure. But do you think if all of the big AAA companies, Ubisoft, Activision, EA, were really pushing for more storage space, that the major consoles wouldn't have at least slightly more space? It's within their interests for the big console manufacturers to keep storage sizes lower. Now, I also want to make this video constructive. How can developers make games smaller? In my humble opinion as a non-game developer, I say look to the past. Compression can increase load times, so find a way to integrate loading screens into gameplay seamlessly, like in Jak and Daxter for example, when you wait for the door. The advantage of this is that it doesn't break immersion. Loading screens are a quick way of removing players from a flow state. Some people argue that these doors were annoying, but I'd argue that they weren't any more annoying than a loading screen. Another thing to look to from the past is lower poly models and lower res textures. I mentioned previously the trend of throwback shooters and pixel art games in the indie space. These are good because they're way less resource intensive and actually manageable for one-man teams. I mentioned previously how good the Halo 1 weapon models look with modern lighting engine. I think devs should focus on using their existing resources more effectively, such as on better lighting rather than pumping extreme amounts into pushing more detailed models and textures. More than anything, to make games smaller, devs should employ better technology and art direction in their games to hide the rough edges. Think of a game like Borderlands 2 and how well that's aged. The best aging games are the distinct stylized ones. Overall, I think the first step towards solving the problem is acknowledging there is one. We need publishers to know that storage is expensive and that they need to address this problem. If games keep getting bigger, just imagine a world where you can only play a tiny handful of games at a time. Remember that there are still many people who don't earn very much or live in poorer countries who are limited by data caps, and that severely limits the amount they can download. Thank you so much if you made it to here. Subscribe and definitely hit the bell notification for more videos like this. If you're interested in gaming and discussion content like this in the future, then definitely subscribe to my channel. As you know, it takes me a while to get these videos edited and out to the public, so your support really helps. Please leave a like and comment your own thoughts on this. Do you think games should be smaller, or are they fine as is? Thanks for watching, and goodbye.